History does not easily forget cruelty, but it never forgets cruelty committed by a parent. And among all the blood-stained stories of the medieval world, few strike deeper than the tale of Irene of Athens, the mother who rose to the throne of the Byzantine Empire and ordered her only son to be blinded. It is a story that begins not with violence, but with a marriage, a promise, and a young woman stepping into a world far more ruthless than she ever imagined. Irene entered history quietly. Born around 752 into a noble Athenian family, she was raised far from the cold marble corridors of imperial power. But Byzantium, then one of the richest, most complex, and most politically treacherous states on earth, was always hungry for alliances. When Emperor Constantine V sought a bride for his son, Leo IV, Irene's beauty, intelligence, and strong family connections made her the perfect choice. At just 17, she was summoned to Constantinople, crowned as imperial bride, and suddenly thrust into a life of unimaginable ceremony and unimaginable danger. Leo IV, called the Khazar, was not a weak man, but he inherited a fractured empire. Byzantium was torn by religious conflict, especially the great iconoclast controversy, a bitter struggle over the use of holy images, icons, and the power of the church. Leo's father and brothers had been fierce iconoclasts. Irene, however, was a passionate supporter of icons. Their marriage, from its earliest days, stood on the fault line of a civil war disguised as a theological debate. Yet Irene understood survival. She remained outwardly obedient, politically cautious, and deeply attentive to her husband's ambitions. In 771, she gave birth to a son, Constantine. For the empire, it meant continuity. For Irene, it meant leverage. And for the factions swirling around the palace, it meant a future battlefield. When Leo died suddenly in 780, possibly from tuberculosis, the throne passed to 10-year-old Constantine VI. Byzantium now had a child emperor and a widowed empress who understood that regency in Constantinople was never temporary. It was a struggle for dominance, for legitimacy, and sometimes for life itself. From the moment Irene appeared before the Senate and army as regent, one thing became clear: she was not a caretaker. She was a ruler. She removed rivals, placed loyalists in key positions, and orchestrated the return of icons by summoning the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, an act that brought her immense support from the church but earned her the undying hatred of hardline iconoclast generals. But behind these early triumphs, a darker tension began to form. The empire was not prepared to accept a woman, any woman, as its true sovereign. Powerful military commanders, elite noble families, and even her own son would eventually turn against her. And Irene, who had learned early that mercy in the imperial palace was indistinguishable from weakness, would respond not with retreat, but with calculation. By the time Constantine reached adulthood, Byzantium was balanced on a knife's edge. Mother and son stood on opposite sides of a widening political divide. One represented tradition and patriarchal legitimacy. The other represented intelligence, ambition, and a will of steel strong enough to defy an empire. The world did not yet know it, but the most shocking moment of Byzantine history was already set in motion. A moment when a mother, backed into a corner by politics, survival, and her own hunger for power, would make a decision so brutal that even medieval chroniclers wrote of it with horror. And this is where their tragedy truly begins. If Irene expected her son to remain a silent emblem of legitimacy while she ruled, she miscalculated. Constantine VI did not grow into the pliable instrument she imagined. Instead, he grew restless, resentful of the regency that kept him sidelined, humiliated, and treated as a child long after he had become a man. And in the Byzantine Empire, where emperors were the living symbols of God's order on earth, nothing was more dangerous than a ruler who felt stripped of his own destiny. By the early 792s, Constantine was in his early 20s, an age when Byzantine emperors had already led armies, crushed rebellions, and fathered heirs. Yet Irene continued to dominate the court. She presided over councils, controlled the palace guard, and made military decisions. Within the great palace, she was surrounded by eunuch officials, fiercely loyal to her, a network she had carefully constructed from the first day of her regency. They acted as her eyes and ears, ensuring that every whisper of dissent reached her before it reached Constantine. And the whispers were growing louder. The army, especially the powerful Armeniac and Anatolic themes, despised being commanded indirectly by a woman. Priests loyal to the iconoclast cause reviled Irene's religious stance. Nobles who hoped for influence saw in Constantine a chance to replace a calculating empress with a malleable young emperor. Constantine began to feel the pressure. To the people, he was the emperor who could not rule. To the army, he was the emperor who hid behind his mother. And to Irene, he was becoming a liability. The breaking point came in 790, when the military finally acted. The Armeniac army openly declared Constantine the sole emperor and demanded that Irene step aside. Mutinies erupted through Asia Minor. For the first time, Constantine tasted real power, not granted, but seized. And with the empire on the brink of civil war, he confronted his mother and forced her into retreat. Irene was removed from the regency, stripped of authority, and confined to the women's quarters of the palace. For a brief moment, it seemed Constantine VI had finally stepped out from her shadow. But he was not prepared. Inexperience, arrogance, and a desperate need to prove himself drove him into a series of disastrous decisions. He mishandled diplomatic negotiations, alienated his strongest supporters, and led an ill-fated military campaign against the Bulgars in 792. The defeat was humiliating. Thousands of Byzantine soldiers were slaughtered, and the survivors blamed Constantine, not their empress mother, for the catastrophe. Sensing the empire's disenchantment, Irene waited and watched and planned. She reached out to dismissed courtiers, to generals who had once mutinied against her, to bishops who owed their positions to her restoration of icons. A quiet network of loyalty began forming in the shadows of the palace, one that Constantine barely noticed until it was too late. In 792, after the Bulgar disaster, Constantine made a fatal mistake. He restored Irene to power as co-emperor. He believed her experience could stabilize the empire. He believed the empire trusted her. He believed, perhaps, that she still saw him as her son. He was wrong on every count. With her authority restored, Irene resumed placing her supporters in critical roles: chancellors, palace guards, commanders. Constantine, distracted by attempts to assert himself militarily, failed to understand that the palace itself was slipping from his control. His mother's influence extended through its marble halls like a tightening net. The tension between them was no longer simply political. It had become personal, raw, and irreversible. Irene saw her son not as an heir, but as an obstacle. Constantine saw his mother not as a mentor, but as a threat. And for the Byzantine Empire, this silent war between mother and son was about to erupt into open conflict. By the early 792s, Byzantium stood like a city split down the middle. Behind its gold mosaics and marble colonnades, the empire watched a slow-moving tragedy unfold. A mother consolidating power with icy precision, and a son staggering beneath the weight of an emperor's crown he no longer controlled. The palace of Constantinople, blinding in its grandeur, echoing with ritual, was becoming the quiet battlefield of a cold civil war. The final breach between Irene and Constantine VI emerged from a deeply personal scandal. In 795, the emperor made a decision that would fracture the empire's moral foundations. He divorced his wife, Maria of Amnia, a pious and well-loved empress. The Armenian and military aristocracy were furious, but the church was outraged. In the eyes of Byzantine canon law, divorce, especially from an innocent wife, was almost unthinkable. Yet Constantine insisted. He remarried quickly, choosing Theodote, a lady-in-waiting of Irene's former household. The act was political suicide. The church condemned it. The people murmured about sacrilege. Even his supporters began to wonder if he cared more about desire than duty. Irene, watching from her steadily growing sphere of influence, understood immediately. Her son had handed her a weapon more devastating than any military defeat. Now she could present herself as the defender of order, piety, and imperial dignity, while Constantine appeared reckless and unfit to rule. From this moment onward, Irene's campaign against her son intensified sharply. The palace guards, the elite scholae, quietly shifted their allegiance to her. Eunuch officials, tightly bound to Irene by years of patronage, began controlling access to documents, audiences, and military commands. Messages intended for the emperor never reached him. Orders meant for the army were lost. Every corridor of the great palace, from the Chalce Gate to the Chrysotriklinos throne room, seemed to whisper her name. Constantine felt the noose tightening. He attempted to flee to the army's themes in Anatolia, regions traditionally loyal to the emperor, not the palace bureaucracy. If he could reach them, he believed he could rally military support and crush his mother's growing faction. But Irene, always 2 steps ahead, ordered the city's harbors watched and the gates reinforced. Constantine was seized before he could escape. He was not imprisoned, but the message was unmistakable. He was emperor in name only. Meanwhile, across Asia Minor, a darker truth was unfolding. Several themes long supportive of Constantine began declaring their loyalty to Irene. She was older, wiser, and less impulsive. She had restored icons, earning her the church's blessing. And above all, she promised stability, something Constantine had repeatedly failed to offer. The empire now had 2 rulers, but only 1 strategist. By 797, the palace was simmering with unease. Rumors swirled of plots, betrayals, and imperial conspiracies. Soldiers whispered that the empress planned to depose her son. Courtiers whispered that Constantine sought to imprison her. Religious leaders openly took sides. The once magnificent unity of the Byzantine court had splintered into factions, each believing history was about to pivot. And they were right. In August of that year, Constantine, feeling the walls closing in, made a desperate attempt to escape Constantinople again, hoping to rally the Armenian theme, but he was betrayed almost immediately. As he rowed toward the Sea of Marmara with a handful of loyalists, Irene's agents surrounded him. He was captured and returned to the capital he had once been destined to rule. For Irene, this was the moment she had prepared for. The boy she had raised, the emperor she had overshadowed, the rival she had outmaneuvered now stood within her grasp. And the empress, who had tasted power and refused to let it slip away, was ready to make a decision darker than any yet seen in the empire's long, turbulent history. Because for Irene of Athens, power was not something shared. It was something taken. In the summer of 797, Constantinople felt like a city holding its breath. Lanterns flickered against palace walls of green porphyry and white marble. Guards moved silently under the August moon, and rumors drifted through taverns, monasteries, and military barracks with an eerie consistency. Something terrible was about to happen. Every corridor, every courtyard, every shadow of the great palace seemed charged with anticipation. For the first time in Byzantine history, the imperial throne itself was about to become the scene of a mother's final betrayal. After Constantine VI's failed escape attempt, Irene confined him to the luxurious but suffocating prison of the imperial apartments. He was technically still emperor, but everyone knew the truth: his reign was over. He simply had not been removed yet. Irene understood the political calculus perfectly. As long as Constantine lived, he would remain a magnet for rebellion. The army would never fully accept her authority while her son breathed. Neither would conservative officials who believed only a male could rule as Basileus. But to murder an emperor outright was unthinkable. The Byzantines had long held that shedding imperial blood was sacrilege. Yet there was a loophole. An emperor could be removed without being killed, as long as his life was spared. And so, in the darkest chambers of the palace, Irene settled on a solution that would make her infamous across centuries: blinding. The blinding of a ruler was not merely a punishment. It was the destruction of legitimacy itself. A blind emperor could not command armies, could not lead processions, could not represent divine order on earth. In the Byzantine mind, physical wholeness was symbolic of spiritual authority. To blind Constantine was to erase him from history without executing him. The plan was laid with chilling precision. Irene summoned her most loyal eunuch officials, men who owed everything to her and would obey without hesitation. She dismissed the palace guards she did not trust and replaced them with soldiers whose loyalties were tied to her through gold, influence, or fear. Courtiers were forbidden to leave the palace grounds. The porticos were sealed. The city gates were guarded. Irene had created a cage of power around Constantinople, and her son was its prisoner. On the night of August 15, 797, the imperial palace fell unnaturally silent. Chroniclers later wrote that even the breeze died as the conspirators moved through its halls. Lanterns were hooded, footsteps muffled, orders whispered. From his chambers, Constantine VI heard the sounds before he understood their meaning: soldiers approaching, keys turning, bolts drawn back. The emperor panicked. History describes him crying out, begging for mercy, calling upon God, the Mother of God, his ancestors, anyone who might intervene. He had once commanded armies, issued decrees, and been hailed as the living representative of divine authority. Now, he was a terrified man, realizing that his own mother had orchestrated his downfall. The guards dragged him to the porphyry chamber, the very room where imperial heirs were traditionally born. It was a calculated cruelty, a symbolic place for the symbolic death of an emperor. There, by order of Irene, the blinding was carried out. No chronicler describes the act in detail, but their silence is more horrifying than any description. What is certain is that the procedure went terribly wrong. Whether by intention or incompetence, the blinding was so violently performed that Constantine VI likely died from the wounds soon after. When the deed was done, the conspirators stepped back. The emperor, now disfigured, dethroned, and possibly dying, was left alone, and the palace, bathed again in unnatural quiet, awaited Irene's next move. At dawn, the decision was announced. Irene of Athens was now sole ruler of Byzantium, Basileus, not Basilissa. The first woman in history to sit alone upon the imperial throne. But the empire she claimed was about to judge her harshly. When dawn broke over Constantinople on August 16, 797, the city awoke to a proclamation unlike anything it had ever heard. Beneath the golden dome of the great palace, heralds announced not a new emperor, not a regency, not even a co-rule, but the rise of Irene of Athens as sole Basileus of the Roman Empire. Not Basilissa, the feminine form used for empress consorts. Basileus, the title reserved for a reigning emperor, a word heavy with the weight of Caesar, Constantine the Great, and Justinian. The shock was immediate and profound. Never in the empire's 1,000-year history had a woman ruled alone. Some citizens cheered, especially clergy, who admired her restoration of icons during the Second Council of Nicaea. Others recoiled, whispering that the empire itself had become unnatural. "A woman has seized the purple," wrote one chronicler, "and the world stands disordered." But Irene cared little for their outrage. She had achieved what no woman before her had dared to imagine, and she intended to rule with the authority, dignity, and iron will of any emperor before her. Yet her triumph was darkened by a secret everyone already suspected. Constantine VI had disappeared. His chambers were sealed, his servants replaced, his name removed from public prayers. Officially, he was merely incapacitated. Unofficially, no one doubted that the blinding had gone horribly wrong and that Irene's only son had died from his injuries. It was the kind of sin that made even hardened Byzantine politicians recoil. Still, politically, she moved with the confidence of a battlefield general. She rewarded her allies lavishly. Eunuch officials rose to unprecedented power, especially her chamberlain Staurakios, whose influence became so immense that foreign ambassadors sometimes addressed him before the empress. Irene filled the palace staff with her supporters, replacing long-serving aristocrats with loyalists who owed everything to her. To stabilize the empire, she launched ambitious financial reforms, reducing burdensome taxes, restoring confiscated properties, and reorganizing the imperial treasury. Many of these policies were surprisingly effective, earning her support from urban elites and common citizens alike. The church, too, embraced Irene more firmly than ever. Bishops praised her as a second Helena, comparing her to the mother of Constantine the Great, the highest compliment possible. For a moment, it seemed Irene might turn her violent rise into a lasting legacy. But the shadows of her past clung to her like a funeral shroud. Word of Constantine's fate spread beyond the palace. Monks whispered about the emperor slayer. Foreign courts reacted with a mixture of disgust and astonishment. In the Frankish kingdom, Charlemagne, already crowned King of the Lombards, already styling himself the protector of the church, heard that the throne of Constantinople was held by a woman who had blinded her son. To him, the imperial Roman legacy now seemed vacant, waiting to be claimed. And inside the empire, deeper cracks formed. The army loathed Irene's reliance on eunuchs. Provincial themes resented being governed by distant bureaucrats rather than battle-tested generals. Some clergy supported Irene, but others murmured that a woman on the throne violated the divine order. The aristocracy despised the idea of a eunuch, Staurakios essentially co-ruling the empire behind the scenes. Most dangerous of all, Irene's rule had no successor. She had eliminated the one person who could guarantee the continuity of her dynasty. Byzantium had a ruler with unprecedented power, but no heir, no military loyalty, and a moral stain so deep that even allies winced when speaking her name. The empire could not escape the truth. Irene's reign was built on a crime too monstrous to forget, and the world, especially the rising Carolingian West, was watching closely. Because Irene's claim to the imperial title had set in motion a geopolitical shift that would shake Christian Europe to its core and nearly replace Byzantium as the heart of the Roman world. By the turn of the 9th century, Irene of Athens sat upon the Byzantine throne with all the ceremony of a Roman emperor, but without the confidence of a secure dynasty or the loyalty of a stable empire. And somewhere far to the west, a powerful ruler watched Constantinople's turmoil with growing interest. His name was Charlemagne, Charles the Great, King of the Franks, master of Western Europe, and a man with ambitions as vast as the old Roman world itself. To Charlemagne, the Byzantine Empire had long been both rival and partner. It claimed the continuation of Rome's imperial legacy, yet in recent years it had been weakened by internal strife, religious conflict, and the shocking rise of a woman who had blinded her only son to seize the crown. In the eyes of many Western clerics, this act made Constantinople's throne morally vacant. A vacant throne, they thought, ought to be filled. That was when an idea, half political maneuver, half theological justification, began to circulate in the halls of the papacy. If Byzantium could not preserve order, perhaps Rome itself should recognize a new emperor in the West, one strong enough to protect Christendom, restore stability, and unify the fragmented lands of Europe. On Christmas Day, in the year 800, in the great Basilica of St. Peter's, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. This moment shook the foundations of medieval geopolitics. For the first time since the fall of the Western Empire, the West had crowned its own Roman emperor. Two rulers now claimed the same title, one in Constantinople, one in Aachen, and the legitimacy of both hung on a delicate thread. Irene, confronted with this unprecedented challenge, reacted with a mixture of outrage and calculation. Outrage, because Charlemagne's coronation was a direct insult, an assertion that Byzantium had forfeited its right to speak for Rome. Calculation, because she realized something else. Charlemagne's bold move exposed the fractures in her own authority. But even in this moment of geopolitical tension, an extraordinary rumor began to circulate across the courts of Europe, one that has fascinated historians for centuries. Charlemagne and Irene were considering marriage. The idea was not entirely absurd. A union between the Western Emperor and the Eastern Empress could have reunited the Roman Empire, healed the ancient political divide, and created a single, colossal superstate stretching from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. Chroniclers of the time recorded that negotiations did indeed take place. Envoys traveled, letters were exchanged, and both courts explored the possibility, at least as a diplomatic strategy. For Charlemagne, marriage to Irene offered the ultimate prize: recognition from Constantinople and legitimate claim over all Roman lands. For Irene, marriage to Charlemagne could have stabilized her rule, secured her from internal enemies, and silenced the criticism that a woman had no right to rule alone. It could have changed the course of European history. But fate and politics rarely allow such grand visions to succeed. Inside Constantinople, Irene's position was weakening. The army distrusted her eunuch officials, the bureaucracy resented her favoritism, the aristocracy despised her financial reforms, and many clergy, though loyal to her religious policies, could not accept the idea of the Roman Empire being ruled jointly with a foreigner through marriage. Opposition grew so fierce that the mere whisper of uniting the empire through matrimony became another weapon for her enemies. To them, it was proof that Irene would sacrifice anything, her dignity, her empire, even its independence, to cling to power. Meanwhile, Charlemagne's court began to suspect that Irene lacked the authority to guarantee such a union. The more unstable her rule became, the less he trusted a shared future. The dream of a reunited Roman Empire faded. The negotiations collapsed. And Irene, once again, found herself alone, surrounded by whispers of betrayal, rebellion, and a palace that no longer obeyed her voice. Her final downfall was now inevitable, and it was coming from within the very palace she ruled. By the early 800s, the magnificence of Irene's reign existed only on the surface. Beneath the shimmering mosaics of the great palace, her power was cracking like the marble tiles of an ancient floor. The empire she once controlled through calculation and fear was slipping away, not with a violent uprising, but with the quiet, cumulative weight of distrust. The army no longer respected her. The aristocracy no longer feared her. The clergy, though grateful for her defense of icons, whispered that the empire needed a man to rule. And the palace bureaucracy, once the backbone of her authority, was beginning to fracture under the ambitions of its own members. The most dangerous of these was Nikephoros, the imperial treasurer. Nikephoros had served Irene loyally for years, managing the empire's finances with exceptional skill. But he was also a man of cold intelligence and precise timing. He saw the writing on the palace walls. Irene was isolated, her political capital spent, her alliances crumbling. To remain loyal to her now meant sinking with a ship already halfway underwater. And so, quietly, he began to maneuver. He built alliances among the bureaucratic elite men who felt sidelined by Irene's favoritism toward eunuchs. He courted military commanders unhappy with the empress's peace-oriented policies. He met with influential bishops who argued that the empire's political chaos was divine punishment for Irene's blinding of her son. By 801, a conspiracy had formed not of assassins or rebels, but of administrators, generals, and churchmen. A coalition made not of swords, but signatures. Meanwhile, Irene remained dangerously unaware of the threat. She believed that her recent diplomatic attempts with Charlemagne had stabilized her legitimacy. She believed the palace officials still feared her. And she believed the church, her staunchest ally, would shield her from internal rivals. She was wrong on all counts. The moment of rupture came in 802, swift, clean, and without warning. It was October. Irene was staying at her palace in the suburb of Eleutherios, on the Sea of Marmara, enjoying a brief retreat from the demands of court. Perhaps she thought distance from the capital would calm the political storms, but distance only isolated her from the levers of power. In Constantinople, Nikephoros made his move. He summoned the Senate, the leading officials, and key clergy. In that assembly conducted with almost ritual efficiency, he declared Irene unfit to rule. He argued that the empire teetered on collapse, that the army despised her eunuch administration, and that foreign powers no longer respected the Byzantine throne. And then, with a boldness that stunned even his supporters, he presented himself as the new emperor. The Senate agreed, the clergy agreed, the army agreed. The decision was unanimous. Nikephoros was proclaimed Basileus. Messengers galloped to Eleutherios. For the first time since she had seized power in 797, Irene was caught completely off guard. She attempted to gather her loyalists, but there were none. She attempted to summon guards, but the guards had already sworn allegiance to Nikephoros. She attempted to flee, but every exit from the city was sealed. Her reign had ended without a battle, without a rebellion, without a single sword drawn. She had been removed by signatures, not soldiers. Chroniclers describe Irene's reaction as a mixture of disbelief and resignation. The woman who had outmaneuvered armies, church councils, nobles, and even her own son, now found herself dethroned by the quiet force of political consensus. For the first time in her life, she was powerless. Her fate now lay in the hands of the empire she had once ruled with iron resolve. And Nikephoros was not finished with her. Irene did not expect mercy. Byzantine politics was a world where fallen rulers rarely lived long enough to reflect on their mistakes. Yet Nikephoros, newly crowned Basileus, chose a punishment far more subtle and far more devastating than execution. He stripped Irene of her titles, her wealth, her attendants, even her clothing of state, and exiled her from the palace she had seized, defended, and ruled for more than 2 decades. Her destination was not a noble villa or a monastic estate near Constantinople. It was Lesbos, a distant Aegean island far from the centers of power. The journey itself was humiliating. The woman who had once traveled in gilded carriages and commanded imperial fleets was now escorted by guards whose loyalty belonged firmly to her successor. When she disembarked on Lesbos, there were no crowds, no heralds, no ceremonies, only a barren wind, the sound of waves breaking against rocks, and a small monastery assigned as her residence. For Irene, this was a living death. She had survived court intrigues, rebellions, military uprisings, the fury of the clergy, and the judgment of foreign powers. But the silence of exile, the absence of power, was something she had never been trained to endure. Yet even in disgrace, Irene remained a figure of fascination, monks whispered that she prayed constantly, weeping for her sins. Islanders claimed she lived austerely, eating simple bread and olives, stripping herself of luxuries, as though trying to cleanse her soul. But others insisted the opposite, that Irene never accepted her fall, that she mourned not her sins, but her loss of authority. Whatever the truth, one fact is certain. Within months of her arrival on Lesbos, Irene was impoverished. She had ruled the richest empire in Christendom, commanded armies, negotiated with popes and kings, restored icons, dominated church councils, and altered the course of Roman history. And yet now she possessed almost nothing. Her gold had been confiscated, her estates reassigned, her remaining servants dismissed. Chroniclers say she was forced to support herself by spinning wool, an almost symbolic reduction of imperial glory into domestic labor. And still, the empire did not forget her. Rumors continued to swirl in Constantinople. Some claimed Irene was rallying support for a return. Others said Nikephoros feared she might escape to Charlemagne's court and ignite a political crisis. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Irene was alone. No army marched for her. No noble raised her banner. Her loyal eunuchs were dead or reassigned. Her alliances had dissolved the moment she lost the throne. She had fought her entire life to achieve unmatched power, only to find herself abandoned by history as soon as she no longer held it. And then, in late 803, the end came quietly. No grand conspiracy, no assassination, no divine miracle, just a lonely death in exile. Some chroniclers say she died of illness, others say of grief. One even suggests starvation, though this is likely an exaggeration meant to dramatize her fall. What is certain is that Irene of Athens, the first woman to rule the Roman Empire alone, died far from the throne she had sacrificed everything to obtain. There was no imperial funeral, no golden burial mask, no procession through Constantinople's sacred streets. The woman who had once commanded the church and emperors was laid to rest in obscurity. Her reign ended, fittingly, not with the roar of power, but with the silence of history closing over her like water. Yet her legacy was far from finished. Because Irene's fall did not simply end a reign, it set the stage for one of the most consequential transformations in medieval Europe, one that would reshape the identity of the Roman Empire itself. Irene's death might have ended her personal story, but its consequences rippled through Europe like an earthquake. Byzantium had lost more than a ruler. It had lost the stability of a dynasty, the legitimacy of continuity, and the moral authority that once anchored its political identity. The empire that had called itself Roman for centuries now faced a crisis of definition. When Irene fell, Nikephoros inherited more than a throne. He inherited a vacuum of legitimacy, a vacuum of succession, a vacuum of imperial purpose. The Carolingian West watched closely. Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the Romans in 800, had based his new imperial dignity on one bold theological argument: that the Roman throne was empty. A woman could not rule. A woman who had blinded her son could certainly not rule. And an empire that tolerated such a crime had forfeited its right to lead Christendom. But now Irene was gone, and Byzantium once again had a male emperor. Nikephoros desperately attempted to reassert the ancient prestige of Constantinople. He reformed taxation, cut waste, strengthened the army, and tried to undo the scandals of Irene's reign. But he lacked what Byzantium needed most: a clear, uncontested dynastic link to the imperial line. Constantine VI was dead. Irene had no surviving heirs. The Amorian and Macedonian dynasties that would later revitalize the empire had not yet risen. Byzantium stood at a crossroads, powerful, yes, but directionless. Meanwhile, Charlemagne's imperial claim continued to gain recognition in the West. For the first time in history, there were two Roman empires, East and West, each asserting the legitimacy of the ancient title. The world had split into two competing visions of Rome, two competing guardians of Christendom, two competing centers of political gravity. Irene had not created this divide, but she had accelerated it. Her blinding of Constantine VI had shattered the sacred principle of dynastic legitimacy that Byzantine ideology depended on. Her rise as sole ruler had forced the West to reconsider the meaning of Roman emperor, and her fall had left the Eastern Empire temporarily leaderless, spiritually wounded, and politically vulnerable. Nikephoros attempted to repair the damage. He reached out to Charlemagne, cautious but diplomatic, willing to negotiate titles and territorial claims to prevent further escalation. In time, Byzantium would grudgingly acknowledge the new Western emperor, not as Emperor of the Romans, but as Emperor of the Franks, a linguistic compromise masking a geopolitical reality. Rome now had two emperors, and neither could erase the other. But if the empire struggled with external legitimacy, the internal consequences of Irene's reign were even more profound. The iconoclast controversy temporarily resolved by Irene would resurface under future rulers, fracturing the church yet again. The prestige of the palace eunuchs empowered by Irene would shape imperial politics for generations. And the precedent of a woman seizing sole imperial power, unthinkable before Irene, would remain in Byzantine memory, half admired, half feared. Most of all, the empire had learned a dangerous lesson. Power seized through blood rarely endures. Irene had blinded her son to secure her rule. But in doing so, she blinded the empire to its own future. Her reign created a century-long struggle over what the Roman Empire was and who had the right to rule it. The Byzantines, proud heirs of Constantine and Justinian, now faced a rival empire that claimed the same mantle. And Europe would never be the same. But Irene's story was not only a tale of political collapse. It was also a moral reckoning, a question that haunted the Byzantine conscience long after her exile. Was Irene a tyrant or a visionary? A monster or a pioneer? A mother corrupted by ambition or a ruler trapped by a world unwilling to accept her strength? History would not answer easily. When Irene of Athens closed her eyes for the last time on the island of Lesbos, no empire mourned her. No funeral procession crossed the Maze. No golden mosaics were commissioned in her memory. The woman who had ruled the greatest Christian empire on earth died in obscurity, far from the palace she once commanded with imperial authority. Yet the silence surrounding her death was only the beginning of her afterlife, because history refused to let her rest. For centuries, Byzantine chroniclers struggled to describe Irene without trembling between condemnation and awe. Some called her tyrannos, a tyrant whose ambition eclipsed natural affection. Others hailed her as a new Helena, the ruler who restored icons and saved the church from the violence of iconoclasts. A few even admired her as a rare political genius in a world that believed women belonged in the shadows. But one fact united every account. Irene changed the empire, and the empire never recovered from her choices. Her blinding of Constantine VI shattered the sacred bond between dynasty and throne. Byzantium had survived civil wars, invasions, and religious schisms, but the deliberate mutilation of an emperor by his own mother shook the ideological foundations of Roman power more deeply than any enemy ever had. The imperial purple was no longer inviolable. Blood no longer guaranteed succession. The throne was no longer protected by divine order. Irene proved it could be taken by force, by cunning, by patience, and by brutality disguised as necessity. Her rule forced Europe to confront a forbidden question. Who has the right to claim Rome? If a woman could be emperor? If a mother could blind her son? If the throne could fall to palace intrigue instead of divine providence? Then perhaps Rome, its legacy, its authority, its destiny did not belong solely to Constantinople. Charlemagne seized that doubt as an opportunity. The papal crown he accepted in 800 was more than a title. It was a declaration that the Roman spirit had outgrown the empire that once bore its name. Irene's rise and fall had created a power vacuum so symbolic, so profound, that Western Europe stepped into it with confidence. Her reign marked the birth of the medieval world as we recognize it. Two Romes, two emperors, two visions of Christian authority. And Byzantium, though still mighty, would spend centuries fighting the consequences of that fracture. Yet Irene's legacy is not merely political. It is personal, psychological, almost tragic in its intensity. She was a woman navigating a world designed to crush her, a mother shaped by a court where mercy was suicide, an empress who fought with intellect, diplomacy, and iron discipline, but who, at her darkest moment, chose cruelty over compromise. Was she evil? Or was she a product of a system that demanded ruthlessness from all its rulers? Modern historians still argue. Some see her as a proto-feminist figure, a woman who seized a destiny denied to her by tradition. Others see her as a warning, the danger of ambition without limits, of power unrestrained by conscience. And some see her as both a visionary and a villain, a pioneer and a tyrant. But one truth stands above all. Irene of Athens remains one of the most unforgettable figures in medieval history because she forces us to confront the brutal nature of power itself. Her story is not simply about a mother and a son. It is about the cost of empire, the fragility of legitimacy, and the dangerous allure of absolute authority. As long as we tell the story of the Byzantine Empire, we will tell the story of Irene, the woman who dared to rule Rome and paid the ultimate price for it. If Irene's story shook you, if it made you question the nature of power, loyalty, and ambition, then don't let it end here. Subscribe for more CHRONOS History-TV storytelling, where forgotten rulers rise again, battles breathe, and history reveals the truth behind the legends. Hit like, leave a comment with which medieval ruler you want next, and share this episode so more people can discover the stories that shaped our world.